It is my honor and pleasure to introduce Jim Weisman today. He is an attorney who specialized the majority of his career in helping people with disabilities and getting equal access, oftentimes to transportation, and in New York City. And then he was also the CEO of United Spinal for many, many years, and is still working with the United Spinal Association. I'm thrilled to call him my friend. I got to know him a little bit doing the role on Capitol Hill, and then since then for many other things. So anyway, Jim, I wanted to let you introduce yourself and kind of tell us. I love the story that you tell about how you got started in the kind of associating with people who have disabilities.
I think I know what you're talking about. Hi, everybody. I'm Jim Weisman. I'm a disability rights lawyer for 44 years, which is about as long as anybody's been talking about this. Maybe a little bit longer, you know. But clearly, this is a relatively new civil rights movement in human history. And it's modeled, obviously, on Blacks and women and other minority rights issues. But how did I get involved? You mean when I was a kid?
So yes, when you were a kid. I like this.
I was 16 and laying on the couch or something, and my father said to me, "You're getting a job or you're going to summer school. You're not laying on the couch." And I had been really trying to get a job, but I didn't drive. So it had to be something I could bike to, and it was just really hard, and I really didn't want to go to school. And there was this girl down the block that was very intriguing to me, who was volunteering at a camp for kids with day camp for kids with disabilities. So I went just because I could volunteer. My father said that was like a job. And I was a lifeguard when I got the job. And the girl, I still kind of know about her, but she's hardly in my life. If you read romance novels, she's an author of them. But my whole life changed. I walked in, I met Paul Hearn, became a good friend of mine. Paul is the leadership award AAPD gives out every year, American Association of People with Disabilities, is named the Paul Hearn Award. We became friends as teenagers, and you know, everyone, I'm preaching to the choir here, but you know, if you know people with disabilities, disability is kind of irrelevant. It's whether they're, decent people or not is what you determine. I'm getting a thunderstorm outside here.
That's okay.
I hope it doesn't interrupt things. And I learned that lesson young, I guess, and stayed friendly with Paul, and we both went to law school, and I was going to be an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn when I was working there when I was in law school. And the city went bankrupt and froze hiring. And I was furious. I didn't have one job interview, and everybody was great. Law school was interviewing. I didn't have one interview. I had this assistant district attorney job guaranteed. And then the city froze hiring, and I was furious. And I ran into Paul Hearn on the street. This is now 11 years after we've been friends, for 11 years. I run into him on the street in Manhattan for 10 years. And I'm holding up the front page of the New York Times that has Secretary Califano, this is 1977, signing the first set of Section 504 regulations after people with disabilities demonstrated outside his house, his church, the White House, Vietnam veterans throwing Purple Hearts back over the fence.
Yeah.
At the White House till they got Califano to sign it. That contained the words reasonable accommodation. Mm-hmm. That's where it came from. That's the thought.
the when Judy Human tells her story about the stuff that was going through, that was what pushed.
That was the thing. That was the week.
Yeah.
And I said it to Paul, hey, congratulations. What it means is localities, anybody, local governments, anybody that gets federal funds couldn't discriminate. I said, hey, congratulations, which was probably me pandering to a disabled guy when I think about it now. But he said it's a piece of paper. I said, what do you mean? This is great. This is like in one place, somebody articulating how to deal with people with disabilities in a way that's not offensive. I mean, this is amazing. And he's going, do you think it's going to change my life, a piece of paper? And we went into a bar on the corner and we had our first discussion after 10 years of friendship about disability rights. I'm not kidding. We both were lawyers already.
Yeah.
And we were friends. So we'd go to a restaurant or bar, they'd say, don't put him there. And I would say, he can speak, talk to him. And I didn't think there ought to be a law or a lawsuit. I thought, what a jerk. I was like everybody else.
Well, you were just like me. Like, even though I had a disability and mine happened in 1987, so 3 years before the ADA, like I thought people were crappy people, but I didn't think that I had any right to do anything about it. And
Right.
yeah.
I feel pretty much that's where I was coming from in those days too. But when you go to law school, and I have 2 of my 3 sons became lawyers, and I warned them that this would happen. When you go to law school, 6 months or a year into law school, your brain has some kind of a change. And I can't exactly explain it, but everyone agrees with me who's done this. Facts start to fall into patterns. You start to think, where's the rub? Where's the friction with the law? There must be a law that prevents this wrongful act. And if there isn't, there should be. I don't know. It just starts to happen. You start to sort facts around to make them useful. And I don't know, you start thinking like a lawyer, I guess. It would be the only way to describe it. And we had this discussion. And one thing led to another, and we wrote a grant proposal for the Legal Services Corporation. Since 19 out of 21 offices in New York City were inaccessible, federally funded. Section 504 required them to be accessible. The Rehabilitation Act required them to be accessible. We wrote a grant proposal to deliver legal services to disabled poor people in an alternative accessible site. And when we opened the door, in came class action after class action after class action. And we were no kids. We didn't know what we were doing. People, we had the crazy kind of legal services lawsuits. A woman was, a deaf woman tied up and forced to watch her husband have sex with his girlfriend. I mean, those kind of normal crazy things that come in. That's not normal, but
Normal crazy, yeah.
It was always crazy, and that was one, but it happened to involve disability. But then also people who couldn't get housing, not because it wasn't accessible, but because the landlord wouldn't even rent to them.
Just because they were discriminating against them?
An NYU student being charged double for his dorm room because his wheelchair took up too much room. Yeah. Which is really inconceivable. This is the 20th century, not the 18th. But they were doing that. A woman who couldn't buy tickets to a singles dance because she was in a wheelchair. A Paralympian swimmer who was denied admission to a public pool because she was in a wheelchair. That one was even crazier. She had to pass a special test by the lifeguard, only for disabled people. Non-swimmers are allowed right in.
Right. Right. If you can walk, but you can't swim and you could drown, you're fine. But if you're in a wheelchair and you're an Olympic swimmer, you're not.
That one went all the way to court and to the Court of Appeals, the first level of appeals in New York State. We lost in court on that.
Yeah.
The world was a different place. So that's why ADA was necessary. That's really why. You had all these deinstitutionalized people trying to live in the community, but no curb ramps, no buses. I mean, no transportation, no internet.
Right.
Meetings were virtual, and
Yeah.
You can get people to me. In the beginning, the Old Testament, in the beginning, there was darkness.
Yes.
There was darkness.
Yeah.
There was not a lot of services available to people to live successfully in the community. And it was a lot of sink or swim.
What year is this approximately?
70s.
Okay. Yeah.
70s.
Yeah.
A lot of Vietnam veterans coming home. Vietnam veterans, whether they were hawkish or dovish on the war, whether they enlisted or were drafted, were not ready to stay home and watch television with a pension check. They just weren't.
Mm-hmm.
United Spinal used to be Eastern Paralyzed Veterans Association. EPVA is 75 years old, and United Spinal, therefore, is 75 this year. 75 years ago in 1946, that organization was started by paralyzed veterans in 2 VA hospitals in New York. From the very first day, it wasn't about, I want to walk. From the very first days, it was about, I want to live outside the institution successfully.
Mm-hmm.
But that keeps changing its meaning, of course.
Right.
Just like rights evolve and knowledge,
Yeah.
people's
It
opinions.
kind of was like, I guess, follow parallels, after World War II is when they started really doing rehabilitation for people with spinal cord injuries and other things like that, because prior to that, they just let you die. But they kind of were forced to deal with it, deal with people coming home paralyzed after a war. And I guess that's what the beginnings of the ADA were.
And the thing that was interesting about that is that when you rehab together, I know there's a substantial number of people on the phone with spinal cord injury or who use wheelchairs. So you could tell me I'm wrong, but I believe when you go through this together, it creates a fraternal relationship. One supports the other. You think your life sucks, my life sucks worse, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and kind of a gallows humor about rehabbing together. But regardless of your politics, if you want to live outside the institution, you have to make changes in the community.
Yeah.
Accepting the status quo would keep you in the institution or in its shadow. And so Vietnam veterans who had all been able-bodied, 100% of them, absolutely knew what able-bodied people think about disability because they thought it.
Wow. Yeah.
And how much regard and how much time they spend thinking about it, which is none.
Zero. Yeah.
They banded together and got together with that disability rights community that was out there, the Judy Humans,
Mm-hmm.
And Paul Hearns,
Yeah.
and in New York, that turned into Sue the City for accessible transportation. So in '79, I came to EPVA. I had been working for a couple of years in legal services and then a 6-week stint in the governor's office that I didn't enjoy.
Yeah.
My boss told me off in front of someone from EPVA, and they called and offered me a job the next day.
Yeah. Those kind of blessings that in disguise, right?
Yes, yeah. But in September '79, we sued transit based on New York state law because there was no federal law. Reagan had, Jimmy Carter was going to make buses accessible, and when Reagan got elected, he undid all that.
Mm-hmm.
So we sued under New York law, saying that non-discrimination must mean we had a non-discrimination on the basis of disability law passed in '74. It must mean you have to change your behavior. It can't mean business as usual, right? It can't mean when you buy a bus, you just buy an inaccessible bus.
Right.
That must be a discriminatory practice. You may not have to fix anything and make it accessible, but when you do something new, how could a non-discrimination law mean anything if it doesn't mean buy it accessibly? So that was our argument on buses.
Mm-hmm.
And on stations. The station
Just listen.
If you're doing a station renovation, you have to renovate accessibly. The non-discrimination law may not require you to act, but once you're acting, you have to act in a non-discriminatory. You know what they argued? Oh, no. We do not post signs that say no handicapped allowed, and we allow people to crawl. This is in writing. I'm not making it up.
Wow.
We allow people to crawl onto the bus or down the steps to the subway if they want to.
How nice of
We
them.
don't discriminate. So their thing is passive non-discrimination. Sit on your hands, treat everybody equally. Blacks, women, Jews, Gentiles, Muslims, treat them all the same. And how could you have discriminated? And up until disabled people came along, that pretty much worked. There was some gender sensitivity out of ladies' rooms and things like that. But treating everybody even-handedly was non-discrimination, and anything else was, let's call it affirmative action. It takes a different law to make that happen, not just a passive non-discrimination mandate. We lost that 3-2 in the highest court in New York State. They said the law only requires passive non-discrimination. However, there was another law in New York that stopped public buildings from being constructed if they weren't going to be accessible, or from being renovated if they weren't going to be accessible. And public buildings was defined as state or municipal buildings, financed with state and municipal funds, including transportation stations and terminals. When this started, I was 28. I never would do this at 48 because it's just too big and too much, but I didn't know.
You were too naive to
I really
know
was.
What a challenge it was.
I just thought like being right was important and having the law on your side. And like, once we point this out, people will agree.
Yes, right, of course. I mean, it's total common sense. Yeah.
Yes, there's never any logical reason for excluding people with disabilities. So you always think once you point it out that people go, of course, no problem. But
no, you're right.
It doesn't work that way. So the transit thing kind of galvanized New York City. Koch was a monster. The mayor, absolute monster. Cheaper to pick them all up in limousines. He was saying stuff like that. He was kind of like
Was that like let them eat cake?
Yes, that's exactly the attitude. The arrogance was incredible, and kind of like a Joan Rivers, kind of like Trump does that nightclub riff thing that he does. Koch would do that about important civil rights things to us, and you think busloads of New Yorkers are going to sit there and let the bus lift operate and brake and
wow.
And he was just horrible about it. And Mario Cuomo, the dad of Andrew, was a lieutenant governor of New York. And it was the International Year of Disabled People in 1981. And they give lieutenant governors nothing to do. So he got to be the delegate to that. And he met all these disabled people incensed about transit 2 years into the lawsuit. And he got caught up in it. And he ran for governor in a Democratic primary against Ed Koch. And they got to fight it out over accessible transit, over people with disabilities.
Wow.
Now, he didn't lose Koch because of us. He lost because he made fun of Chinese food in upstate New York. That's true, by the way. People were so offended because he's so arrogant that he could offend anyone. But we had a friend now in the Capitol, and we made transit accessible in New York. And making transit accessible meant lifts on all new buses, paratransit for those that can't use accessible transit, and key stations, which was the most we could get any right-thinking Democrat to agree to. Making all stations to them was just inconceivable at that time.
Wow. Yeah.
And then we sued Philadelphia and did the same thing. So it's now 1988.
So I got shot the year before that, so. Yeah.
Right. So we're working now on ADA now for you.
Yeah. Right. And there's still boards over steps at LSU. The professors are still giving me crap about moving moving a classroom down so that I can get to it, that kind of thing. They're still not nice about it at that point. They do it reluctantly and slowly, but.
Yes, all the time that this was going on, when the ADA was introduced, Justin Dart, who was a very wealthy disabled guy, post-polio.
Texas guy.
Pardon me?
He was from Texas, right?
Yeah, Texas. And his dad was a zillionaire. He went around the country having hearings, unofficial, where he invited the disability community come in and talk about discrimination against them. And the stories were incredible. Half of it done by government.
Yeah.
Half of the offenses were state and local governments, school systems, police departments, libraries. I mean, all the places where people with disabilities interface with government, there was a problem.
Right.
And it created this enormous record and raised everybody's interest. Congress was amazing with this. Usually Congress is, for lack of a better word, limping along behind the rest of society and trying to catch up socially. And it's,
right.
The social mores are usually ahead of the law.
Yeah.
People are smoking pot before it becomes illegal. It's not like we're all waiting for them to tell us that it's okay. It's that they catch up. They go, "Oh, it must be okay."
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
When it comes to discrimination on the basis of disability, Congress was out in front here, and that is I've learned in the 30-something years since. It's pretty unusual. First, Tony Coelho, who was a congressman from California, he stood up on the floor of the House, announced that he was an epileptic, that he was studying to be a priest. When he had a seizure, he was thrown out of the seminary and got into politics. And he is going to sponsor the ADA because he sees how it can wreck your life if you don't have protection from discrimination. And then Lowell Weicker in the Senate, senator from Connecticut, who had a mentally disabled child, sponsored the ADA in the Senate. That was 1988. The legislative session ended like a month or two later. The bill had been introduced, but,
Died.
Congress every 2 years, the bills don't pass, they have to come back in. You guys who go to the roll on Capitol Hill know that.
Yeah.
We
have a new bill number, right? And
it starts over. It's like it never happened. Coelho has to leave the House. Some financial thing. He's still very active in disability. Many of you have seen him, I'm sure, and know who he is. And Weicker loses his election. So we lose our sponsors. Amazingly, Steny Hoyer from Maryland, who had no disability background whatsoever, nor did his staff, takes over the bill from Coelho, just because Coelho asked him to when they were friends.
Right.
And Hoyer makes this his life's work.
Yeah, and he's still involved.
Yes. And Tom Harkin from Iowa.
Yep, still involved.
Who had a deaf brother, took it in the Senate. And the next 2 years, it was only 22 months. Those next 2 years were the best thing I've ever been involved in.
And 22 months is like a minute in like congressional time.
That's really true. You see how many times we've gone back on the same issues.
Yeah. Nothing happens in 22 months.
No, but this was kind of, the crest of the wave was happening. It was, there was something in the air or something, It was very grassrootsy.
Before the internet.
Oh yeah, it was much harder. First time I went to Washington on ADA was Roe versus Wade Day, but I don't keep that date in my mind. I think it's in March or February, but I don't. It's not like a day I think about. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know it was Roe versus Wade Day, and I got there very early. and I was in a meeting with the blinds closed the whole day. And I got home late back to New York. And when I got home, I turned on CNN, and there's all these people marching past the building I was in. And I had no idea what was going on outside. And I decided that that was the metaphor for Washington. They have no idea what's going on out there unless we tell them.
Wow. Yeah.
It was really an amazing symbol, you know?
Yeah.
And
Wow.
the grassroots lobbying was telling them. A woman named Liz Savage, who went on to work for the Justice Department for many years after this, but she was working for, I think, epilepsy at the time. She's a blind lawyer. She coordinated all the grassroots lobbying. Pat Wright, a woman from DREDF, Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund in Berkeley, basically commanded the troops. And she was the liaison with the White House, the liaison with Harkin and Hoyer. Democrats disagreed on things in this. It's not like it is now where you know that the majority of one party is going to be this and that.
Right.
Disability was bipartisan, and therefore opposition to disability issues was bipartisan as well.
Yeah.
This was 1989 now, let's say. AIDS is terrible, and there's no cure. So there's fights between intra and inter party and intra and inter house on should we cover people with AIDS? Should they be protected from discrimination? And the range of opinions from elected officials went from Congressman Dannemeyer in Orange County, California, who said AIDS is God's will. Why should we do anything to intervene? Because he had an anti-gay streak. To the most of the people that were disability rights oriented in the House and Senate were saying, we'll treat it like any other disability. Right. If it can be accommodated, we'll do it.
Yeah.
It probably wouldn't have been included if it wasn't explained to them that if employers can fire people just because they are HIV positive, they will die at great expense to government. And if they can work until they can't, they will die.
Wow.
On the employer's health policy.
It's always about the.
Well, maybe not always, but it was enough to push
it.
It was enough that Congress did the right thing by people with AIDS and HIV. There's weird amendments made because disability was not understood. Accommodation was not understood. Jesse Helms amended it so that anything having to do with sexuality is not a disability. So that homosexuality, which was not controversial because they're not disabled and didn't think they were. Mm-hmm. There was no homosexual or disabled lobby, so no one opposed it. It's just embarrassing. And pyromaniacs are not covered by the ADA because it's a psychological term Jesse Helms knew. That's the only explanation. Pedophiles, that kind of stuff. And there was actually a discussion about what pedophilia is. Is it foot fetishism or is it child molesters because of the confusing PED root word in pedophilia for Congress when it's considering perversion? And this was a real insane diversion, but it's in there. Those things are in there. And the one that didn't get in there is the food handler amendment. Anybody in the food handling business was going to be exempt from the ADA because they might, spit into the, drool. And of course, that's thousands of, there's from airline personnel to cooks to waiters and waitresses. It just went on forever. And that was happening on the floor as the votes were, those were floor amendments. That one. It could have happened because people don't give it any thought, but it didn't, luckily.
Yeah.
But one of the big issues was transportation because under the Reagan, who is responsible for ADA, by the way, people don't know, but Reagan told the National Council on the Disabled, write me a report about what everybody needs who's disabled in the United States to, live I don't know, lives of satisfaction,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And they took it seriously. It was all Republican appointees. He's a presidential commission, but they had a staff. They took it seriously and did a report. Reagan took the report is called Toward Independence. Reagan took the report, accepted it. I don't know if he knew what was in it because he was opposing lots of the things it was proposing, when like accessible transportation, for example.
Uh-huh.
But he said, write it up like a statute. And so they went back and did it. And a guy named Bob Bergdorf, who worked for the National Council and then became a law professor, he, disabled lawyer, he wrote the first draft of the ADA.
Wow.
And Bush is now running for president in '88. He is working for an administration that did this report, but is also actively opposing lifts on buses and lawsuits and things. But the statute that they're touting, the ADA, requires it.
Right.
Nobody had a problem with that on their side, on the Bush side or on the Reagan side. And it was great for us. Bush said he would support the ADA if he was elected. Dukakis, that's who he ran against, for those of you too young to remember. Dukakis never mentioned the ADA. Bush gets elected. The disability community, by May or June of that year, he's inaugurated in January, was very antsy about where's your ADA support, Mr. President, and started demonstrating and things. I know that everybody says that Orrin Hatch and Bob Dole were like the Republicans that did it in the Senate, and that's kind of true. But if Bush didn't say okay, they weren't doing anything in June or May, whenever I'm telling you those demonstrations were, until Bush said do it. And then Bob Dole.
Was it the demonstrations that catapulted him, to do it, you think?
I think they would have done it anyway.
Yeah.
Looking back, then I did think that, yes.
Mm-hmm.
The counsel to the president, Boyden Gray, who was counsel to the vice president when Bush was vice president, he was best friends with a guy named Evan Kemp. Evan Kemp is the quadriplegic in the picture of the signing of the ADA.
Yeah.
There's that one guy up there, right, in the big motorized chair.
Yeah.
That's Evan Kemp. He was the head of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He was a college friend and I think played bridge with Evan Kemp. And Evan Kemp was a Republican, but very active in disability rights.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a sympathetic ear in the president's counsel's office. Not all that sympathetic. It was very hotly contested.
Right.
And transportation was very controversial.
So what is controversial about the fact that, like, if you don't have transportation or housing, you can't get a job? If you don't have transportation, you can't get to work, and that people who work pay taxes.
And that is the reason the ADA passed. Not the transportation piece, but the left and the right could always agree on one thing: everybody who can work should.
Yeah. Right?
The left is so that they can cure cancer and write the greatest novel ever written. And the right is those sons of guns. They're always taking money from us, let them work and pay tax. But either way, everyone agrees, the left and the right, that people who can work should.
Yeah.
And so I think that's what got it to the finish line. But the reason transportation was controversial was that Reagan's had made such a mess of the transportation and accessibility mandate from Carter that some cities were doing lifts on buses only, which was perfectly okay under the Reagan rules. Some were doing paratransit only, which was okay under the Reagan rules, and some were doing a little of both. And some were doing almost nothing, maybe half. So the transit lobby and the American Public Transit Association that represents them had trouble taking a position on the ADA's transportation provisions because its own members were all over the place in how they were delivering the services, although almost 100% of them were delivering them badly. And transportation has always been a civil rights issue in the US. Plessy versus Ferguson 1896. Separate but equal was a rail cars case for blacks and whites. And now it's the same thing. You can't have a separate system that's going to cost a fortune. If you think about it, it's consumed services.
Yeah.
It's the second the ride is over, it's in thin air, it's gone. You can't do paratransit only and provide meaningful service in an urbanized area. You just can't. It's just too much demand.
Right.
And
it's still a thing in Baton Rouge. I mean, honestly, I really don't know how accessible our city buses are, and so it's paratransit, and they can't keep up, so no one can get to a doctor's appointment on time. Huh?
Every mass transit bus in the United States is accessible. We've changed the meaning of the word bus to accessible bus, at least when it comes to mass transit.
Right.
But there's still all kinds of things wrong. I mean, airplanes are my favorite. It's amazing how that industry got a pass.
Yeah.
Everybody else has made wholesale changes in how they do business. Almost everybody else. And the airlines have convinced everyone what Greyhound during the ADA disputes tried to convince everyone that they'd go out of business if they had to be accessible.
Yeah.
Because every square foot is
right. A dollar, money.
Is money, and that's what the airlines do too. And Greyhound got away with it. They got a little extra time.
You know who else gets a pass? Not transportation wise, but my big thing lately has been medical accessibility, and all of these physicians' offices across the country, all of mine included, that have no accessible tables for us to get on. We don't have a scale to be weighed on. How can we get proper medical care when none of it's accessible? And the doctors of all the people, no offense, have the money in their practice to get one accessible table. Anyway, that's off the topic of transportation, but there's still a few gaps.
By the way, it is required too.
Well, they don't do it, so I guess I need to sue some people.
It has to be accessible. When you're buying a Xerox machine, it should be that somebody in a chair can operate it. How well that works, I don't know, but that is the Justice Department interpretation of ADA.
I can't work most Xerox machines, I will say, or get on any medical tables. And I'm a para. I mean, we're not even talking about quads and people with more severe disabilities than mine.
Yeah, no, I hear it all the time. This is a fits and starts kind of issues. Disability rights has these huge gains, and then you don't notice, and then another huge gain. It's hard to say. Most people think we're talking about dessert, and that the meal's already been served. Disabled people, they've already had dinner. Now we're just talking about when we talk about their rights. And they don't realize how difficult it is to just exist successfully in the community, and how many points of friction there are in a person's life. Yeah. Most of them are illegal.
Yeah. So I want the story about you getting to, because you got to help draft the legislation. You can tell a little bit about that. And then you got to be there at the signing. I think you thought it was going to be like 10 people, and it was like.
Yeah, I was embarrassed by that too. We didn't have transit experts on the disability side. Transit experts, which there are many of, and now there's many that do disability, obviously, because it's big business. They were sympathetic, but their employers were transit agencies. So they didn't want to help us. Most of them got it. Most of them were pretty good about it. We once had a guy say to us, transit would be happy if nobody took the bus or the train. They'd be clean all the time. There'd be no crime. There'd be no vandalism. Maintenance would be, the only thing is there'd be no rides. So what? That's mostly the way one of the consultants told us. But he said, we wish you luck, but we're not going to get business from you guys. So people like me who had been doing transit for years, because it was 11 years since we'd sued MTA when ADA happened. And, I made the deal in June 84. ADA is 1990. We made the deal in Philadelphia in 88. So I'd watched implementation for a while. I knew what we did wrong. I got called by a congressman from Brooklyn named Major Owens, who his staff, and I immediately got involved with the House. It was called the Public Works and Transportation Committee then. And they had all the stereotypical misconceptions of people with disabilities on public transit. My favorite is victims of crime. That the Congress and elected are so worried about people with disabilities being victims of crime on public transit. However, if you're not on it and you're a victim of crime, they couldn't care less.
Right.
You're living in substandard housing in a crappy neighborhood because of your disability, where more crime is than isn't, and they're not worried about protecting you there. The only way to change that is to make you a worker and give you income and get you out of that neighborhood.
Wow.
But those things get constant of people getting sick on public transit. What about disabled people getting sick on public transit? I live in New York City. I mean, people get sick on public transit every day.
Right. All kinds of people.
That's like it's par for the course. Yeah. But they brought up all this nonsense like that. But we got a statute drafted. Bud Schuster from Pennsylvania, the Democratic chairman of the Transportation Committee in the House, opposed lifts on buses. He yelled at me once, "Look at my knuckles. They're raw from pushing my mother's wheelchair through doorways that are too narrow. I know what we're talking about, and I wouldn't put my mother on a bus."
Well, that's good for him.
And I said, "Well, that's great. Your mother's an elderly woman. I'm talking about people 19. They're going to be in a wheelchair for the rest of their life. Are you going to pension them off? Or are you going to have them work?" But we just never connected. We never did. Schuster was in the way on the accessible transit stuff. But Norman Mineta, who eventually became Secretary of Transportation, was a congressman from San Jose. He had been mayor of San Jose. He had bought all lift-equipped buses. He had a great relationship with his disability community. He opposed his chairman and led a Democratic wave through the Transportation Committee to support lifts on buses, and lots of Republicans did also. Johnstown, Pennsylvania was an early town that had lifts on all its buses.
Wow.
And they came and the guy testified. He said, "I'm not a civil rights hero. It's cheap. It cost me some X thousand, I think 9,000 in those days, a bus and some maintenance.
Right.
And I'm a good operator, so they're going to work, and I'm going to take people in chairs if I've got them because I'm responsible. But I'm not a civil liberties guy," he would say. So transit was interesting. I still deal with them all the time.
Yeah.
But it was an amazing fight. Anyway, Congressman Dingell from Michigan, his widow is still the congressperson. He was the longest serving congressman. The story is he saw an episode of LA Law about Tourette's syndrome. Mm-hmm. And he didn't, I don't know if this is true, that part, and that he didn't want people with Tourette's on Amtrak because his grandchildren took Amtrak to Washington to visit him, and they yell out obscenity. That was his take on the LA Law Show.
Right.
So he wanted to amend the ADA to take out mental disability altogether. It would only be physical disabilities, both intellectual and emotional disabilities. So we got mental health advocates in Michigan to write them. And we got the president, which Dingell was angry about, by the way, because we ratted him out.
Right.
His constituents. And we got the president of Amtrak, a guy named Claytor, to come see Dingell. And this is getting to the bill signing, I promise.
I know.
And Dingell told him about the amendment, and he said, "Well, our ticket salespeople don't do diagnoses. So if you have the fare, we're going to sell you a ticket."
Right.
And our conductors aren't throwing you off the train for being disabled. If you're dangerous, they'll throw you off. So we think it's over. Dingle and Clater leave. One of the staffers, who's a law professor at American University, by the way, says, "What about people who eat with their feet?" I say, "What do you mean people who eat with their feet? People with no arms?" "Yes." He goes, "You want to be on the train next to someone who's eating with their feet?" And I said, "Me? You're asking me?" "Yes, I would." He goes, "You would?" "Yeah." I said, "I'm in this business and I've only seen that a couple of times. And, for $200, you get to Miami anyway, and you get to see that." And I kind of like uncomfortably giggled my way out of the room, along with a couple of other people. And the bill gets passed. This is a long forgotten story. I might not have even remembered it. And I'm on vacation with my kids in Nantucket, and I thought the bill might be signed while we were away, so I took a suit with me. And I get the call from my office that the White House is inviting you to the bill signing. And I'm picturing what you always see. You're standing behind the president in his office, and there's like 10 or 12 people, and he signs and he gives you a pen. And I'm going to be one of those people, and I can't imagine how lucky I feel. And I get in the cab in Washington. I say, "To the White House." The guy takes me to the White House, and there's 1,000 people on the White House lawn.
Right. That's what you said.
And I feel like the biggest jerk in the whole world. And how lucky I was to be involved and be riding the crest of this disability rights wave right when a wave is breaking, and I'm here. And the bill is signed, and President Bush makes this great speech, and he goes to sign the bill. And if you've ever seen it, they have pens lined up, and they sign G, and they give a pen.
Yeah.
And in that famous picture that I talked about with Evan Kemp in the wheelchair, there's another guy standing up who's a bilateral amputee at the shoulder. His name is Reverend Harold Wilkie. He just passed away a couple of years ago. He steps up behind President Bush to take the pen. And Bush is looking at the audience, and Wilkie's over here. And Bush, there's a kind of a gasp from the audience, and Bush laughs and smiles, and Wilkie takes off his shoe and grabs the pen with his sock, and I think he stuck it in his pocket.
Wow.
And it was the coolest thing.
Is that on video somewhere?
It is. There's a very grainy video of it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, wow.
And I think that the ADA Technical Assistance Center, the southern one, I think, has the video. I think that's
okay. Okay.
I'll try to get it for you.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. I mean, and
But
nobody.
of course, that staffer was in the audience also, thinking the bill's not even signed yet, and those people who eat with their feet are up there with the president, But
Right.
the rest of us, really, it's this stupid little metaphor, but just because you think it can't be done doesn't mean it can't be done. Is
right. Yeah.
thing. So I'm done. I know.
Well, probably nobody wants you to be done, because this is all fascinating, and it, you're still a young guy, so it's kind of crazy to me, like, because this is such a historical event, so meaningful to me, to people with disabilities, and to everybody that works at New Motion, whether they have a disability or not. But to be able to hear these stories about where we came from and where we are today, it's thank you for all of your work. And yeah, I know that we, as you've said, we've come a really, really long way since just the 70s, and we've got some really big battles ahead still. So I'm glad you're still fighting the fight with us. So I guess what I'll do now is, if anybody wants to put any questions in the chat, I can read them to Jim. Yeah. Holly's quoting from President Bush. He said, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down." That he said that I guess when you were there.
He did. It was amazing. That was, it was one of those things where you never really have days like that. I guess, you graduate college or high school or something where like there's this collective effort and it's all happening at once and everybody gets what it's about. The ADA was really that. It was this exquisite coming together, maybe for the first time, of people with disabilities.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen it since the same way.
I know.
Maybe the Affordable Care Act, not its passage, but trying to keep it from being repealed. Maybe that brought disability together as much.
Yeah.
But even that was divisive politically.
Yeah.
Whereas the ADA was all disabled people were all in.
Yeah.
There was no opposition.
Yeah, it is a beautiful thing though to see the role on Capitol Hill, which I was doing something the other day and someone asked me, how did COVID change things for people with disabilities? Well, on the one hand, we got more telehealth and we got we're now can work from anywhere. If we had the broadband internet, that's a whole nother fight that we're still in rural areas. But let's just say that we've increased opportunities for people with disabilities through being able to work remotely and to be able to see our doctor remotely. But they're not being visible. Like right now, I'm a wheelchair user and no one can tell.
And also, all this remote means no exposure.
Right. We're not rolling like hundreds of people in wheelchairs rolling on to Capitol Hill. That is a force to be reckoned with. That is something that gets the attention of our representatives and of the staffers and all of that. It was great that we had the virtual roll on Capitol Hill and we did have a lot of participation, but it's not the same. And I want to be back in the community. I want to be visible again. I want to be, well, first of all, I'm a bit of an extrovert, so I miss seeing you. I miss hugging people. Yeah, you never noticed? Yeah. Yeah. So, but on top of that, like now that the world is maybe getting back to normal a little bit, increasing the visibility of people with disabilities, I think is also key to all the battles that we still have to fight.
Oh, I do agree. I also think, and this is new motion relevant. I also think that medical equipment, durable medical equipment, people think that Obamacare protected people with disabilities. And it did to the extent that a pre-existing condition would cause you to not take a job or to have a waiting period or an exclusion altogether on insurance. But not covering medical supplies and equipment or allowing caps on medical supplies and equipment is absolutely oppressive, as is home care of severely disabled people that need personal care attendants cannot work really. I mean, there's little programs now where you can, but nobody's going to amass wealth. Nobody can be entrepreneurial.
Right.
There's more to do.
There's a lot more to do. Yeah, that stops a lot.
Exposure is the only answer. The more, if you're not out there, people don't know.
Right. Yeah. So we've been, I think a lot of advocates are, we use social media as much as we possibly can to get these messages out, but it's not the same as sitting in front of your elected official or going to the news and being on camera. Like it's doesn't have the same impact. And yeah, you're right. I've been really lucky because being a paraplegic, I don't need a caregiver. I'm able to work a full-time job and have all the benefits of working a full-time job. But for people who need a caregiver, if we cap what they can earn and then they lose their caregiver, I mean, and it's so expensive to hire full-time care. It's cost prohibitive to work.
And it's worse. As you look out to what the ramifications of this, illegal aliens are all being hired to do, or undocumented, whatever we can call them, are all being hired to do home care by Medicare recipients because they pay out of their own pockets for care. Medicaid recipients are hiring documented immigrants to do the exact same job.
Yeah.
None of this makes any sense. This should be a career path for them. It shouldn't be employment of last resort for them, and it shouldn't require you to cheat if you're on Medicare, which every old person that needs home care is doing.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just the nuttiest system that we've set up. It's so 1950.
Yeah.
And that has to be fixed.
Yeah.
And I see a couple of complex rehab technology comments coming by, and I completely agree with that stuff. It's really a mess what's happened, and the Obama administration clearly knew what they did.
Right.
And they were there long enough for us, even if they didn't know when they did it,
they knew.
who had been trying to correct it.
Yeah.
Many of you know Henry Claypool. He was in the Obama administration. He's a member of ours. We thought he was going to go to HHS and fix this stuff and the home rule and stuff. And, some of this horrible stuff hangs on.
Yeah.
And it's so antiquated. It's so not what we're talking about living in the community and succeeding.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we have to develop role models and leaders for other people with disabilities while assimilating our role models and leaders, which is an interesting, balance. You want to look assimilated and feel assimilated, but you still want them to identify with disability.
Right. Yeah, that is a fine line. People are like, well, do you mind being called disabled? I'm like, no, I really don't. And person first, like a disabled person, it's part of my identity. So I'm very proud of my disability at this point. I may not have been a few years in, but I certainly am now. And, so yeah, I want to be treated like everybody else, but don't forget, but in order for that to happen, we can't forget that we have certain needs that are different from other people's needs, but can be really productive members of society. Clearly, some of the smartest people I know are living with a disability, and to count us out is just a huge mistake on a business level, even.
Yes, and also people are going to live to be 100.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems almost inconceivable to me, but I know that it's true, and that my children or my children's children will live to be 100.
Yeah.
And they're going to have all kinds of mobility impairments.
Yeah, exactly.
They're still going to age when we weren't made to live this long.
This is a club that anyone could join at any time, the disabled community. Okay, so we'll end with this because we only have a couple minutes left. But Sarah Jacoby said, with all the lessons learned over the years, what is your greatest lessons you've learned about yourself through this journey?
My lesson is bigger. I had a terrible car accident when I was 22. And I was in the hospital 4 months and then home in a body cast. And I realized that I came really close to dying, obviously. And I realized that the world would have been exactly the same place. There would have been a little ripple in the pond, and then it would have been smooth, my girlfriend, my parents, and then it would have been like I never was there. And it was a hard lesson because I had a year to lay around and think about it. And the lesson is, I think that if your life is going to have meaning, you have to give it meaning. You provide it. You just don't. It just doesn't happen. I was somewhat of a hedonist, I guess, before when I was young, so
yeah,
it's allowable. Yeah. It's allowable, but I feel like you're always happier when you have a purpose and you're working towards it, even if you're not successful. I feel like that about people with disabilities. When I came to EPVA, wheelchair sports was huge. I had that background because I had the summer recreation, and I also ran the high school recreation program for the disabled kids when I was in high school on Friday nights, bringing in bands and stuff like that, and got the Knicks to come and do exhibitions. That was when they were actually poor people, professional basketball players. But I really did get it at an early age that if you have a purpose, you'll be happy. And I feel like people with disabilities, we're not a cure organization.
Right.
We're certainly not against cures. We're all for cures.
Right. Yeah.
But what gets people with disabilities outside the look what happened to me?
Right. Yeah.
Some people, it's wheelchair sports.
Yeah. For me, it was not.
They're out there, they're meeting people, they're having fun, there's life after death, whatever it is.
Yeah.
They get it and they go on. it's not just wheelchair sports that makes their life expand. It begins the expansion. I think advocacy does that for a
It does
huge
do
number of
that. I don't know if you probably don't know this, but what you did, just the whole existence of United Spinal was I'm not a sports person. I like to work out, but I can't compete. I'm not very coordinated. I'm just not good. But when I did the Miss Wheelchair Louisiana, I've always done advocacy on a small scale, but here in Louisiana, and then did Miss Wheelchair Louisiana, Miss Wheelchair America, and then started going to the role on Capitol Hill. As soon as I became addicted. The first role on Capitol Hill, when I realized that we could impact, that we could make change, that became my club. That is where I began to really thrive and just eat, drink, breathe like disability advocacy, right? So I guess we're it's 101 and I don't want it to end, but it has to. So I just want to say thank you, first of all, for all that you've done for people with disabilities. And then thank you for sharing your time with us this week, celebrating the ADA with us.
Well, I'm very shy also, so
I know. Yes.
I had a great time, and thank you.
Thank you.
Always good to see you.
All right. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, y'all. Thank you.